A quiet flight to Tokyo takes an unexpected turn when Jonathan Harris, a former judge known for dismantling corrupt corporations, finds himself in the middle of a high-stakes mission. Traveling to protect Sarah King, a whistleblower with evidence that could expose a powerful company, Jonathan must navigate a web of danger and betrayal. As shadows close in, a mysterious pursuer aboard the plane reveals that Sarah's enemies will stop at nothing to silence her. When they land, Jonathan, Sarah, and their newfound ally Marcus are thrust into a race against time to uncover the truth and survive the threats lurking at every turn. This story of resilience and justice unfolds with unexpected twists, intense confrontations, and a final battle for what truly matters. And make sure to subscribe. Before we go any further, comment below, where in the world are you watching from? Jonathan Harris sat quietly in his seat by the window, his weathered hands clutching an old book. Beside him, Marcus Grant adjusted his tailored suit, exuding confidence as he ordered a glass of champagne. "So, what brings you to Tokyo?" Marcus asked, his tone dripping with disinterest. Jonathan looked up with a faint smile. "Business," he said simply, turning back to his book. "Let me guess," Marcus continued, swirling his champagne. "Consulting? Something small time, maybe?" Jonathan chuckled softly. "Something like that." Their conversation faded as the flight attendants began moving through the aisle. Marcus couldn't help but glance at Jonathan's humble attire, comparing it to the other first-class passengers' designer suits. He found it baffling that someone like Jonathan belonged here. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Marcus leaned closer, his curiosity piqued. "You know, it's rare to see someone who doesn't flaunt their success up here. What do you do exactly?" Jonathan closed his book and turned to Marcus, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm a retired judge," he replied. Marcus blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected that. "A judge? You don't look the part." Jonathan chuckled again. "And you don't look like someone who cares about what others do." Marcus raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to take offense. The exchange was interrupted by the flight attendant, who handed Jonathan a bottle of water. "Just water?" Marcus asked, his smirk returning. "You're really missing out on the perks of first class." Jonathan took a sip and replied, "Sometimes simplicity is all you need." For the rest of the flight, Marcus tried to focus on his laptop, but his thoughts kept drifting to Jonathan. There was something about him, his calmness, his simplicity, that both intrigued and irritated Marcus. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen the man before, though he couldn't place where. As the cabin lights dimmed for the night, Marcus leaned back in his seat, staring at the ceiling. "A judge," he muttered to himself. Unbeknownst to him, Jonathan was watching him quietly, his piercing eyes observing every move. "Funny," Jonathan thought. "You've forgotten me, Marcus. But I haven't forgotten you." The plane hummed softly as it soared through the night, carrying two men toward a destination that would forever change their lives. The cabin was steeped in a heavy silence as most passengers drifted off to sleep. The hum of the plane was soothing, but Marcus Grant's mind raced with unease. He kept glancing at Jonathan, who sat motionless, his book resting on his lap. What kind of judge travels like this? Marcus thought, sipping his champagne. He didn't fit the image of power and prestige Marcus associated with the position. Yet, Jonathan's calm presence unsettled him, as though the man carried an invisible authority that couldn't be ignored. Unable to suppress his curiosity any longer, Marcus leaned over. "So, Judge Harris, what kind of cases did you preside over?" Jonathan looked up slowly, his eyes meeting Marcus's. For a moment, Marcus felt as though he were being examined under a microscope. "Civil rights cases," Jonathan replied evenly. "Landmark ones at times." Marcus frowned, the words sparking a faint memory. "Civil rights, huh? That's noble work." "Necessary work," Jonathan corrected, his voice firm but not unkind. Marcus nodded absently, his mind racing. Civil rights cases. Landmark rulings. Something about the man's face tugged at a distant corner of Marcus's memory, but it remained just out of reach. Their conversation was interrupted when a flight attendant approached Jonathan. She leaned down and whispered something in his ear. Jonathan's expression remained impassive, but he nodded. "Everything all right?" Marcus asked, feigning casual interest. "Just routine," Jonathan replied, his tone neutral. "Routine?" Marcus thought, unconvinced. The flight attendant had looked far too nervous for it to be anything ordinary. Marcus shifted in his seat, growing increasingly uneasy. "You said your name was Harris, right?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. Jonathan's lips curved into a faint smile. "That's correct. Judge Jonathan Harris." The name echoed in Marcus's mind. It felt familiar, like the lyrics to a forgotten song. Then it hit him: a courtroom, a case, and the face of a younger Jonathan Harris presiding over it with unyielding authority. "Wait," Marcus said, sitting up straighter. "You were the judge on the Wacth versus Crestfield Corporation case, weren't you?" Jonathan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his water bottle, taking a deliberate sip. "You've done your research," he said at last, his voice calm but pointed. Marcus's heart began to pound. The Wacth case had been one of the most controversial rulings in corporate law, exposing systemic discrimination and leading to sweeping reforms. And Marcus, fresh out of law school, had been involved on the losing side. I remember now," Marcus stammered. "You ruled against my firm. That case cost us millions." "It wasn't about the money," Jonathan said, his gaze piercing. "It was about justice." Marcus felt his confidence falter under the weight of Jonathan's words. The memory of that case, the heated debates, the mounting evidence against Crestfield flooded back. He had been so sure of their invincibility, yet Jonathan's verdict had shattered that illusion. "I was just doing my job," Marcus muttered almost defensively. Jonathan's expression softened, but his eyes remained sharp. "And I was doing mine." As Marcus sank back into his seat, the full weight of their shared history began to settle over him. He had spent years burying the memory of that loss, but now, sitting beside the very man who had delivered the ruling, he felt it resurface with startling clarity. "Funny how paths cross," Jonathan remarked, his voice low. "Sometimes they're more connected than we realize." Marcus didn't respond. He stared out the window at the endless darkness, his mind churning with questions. Why was Jonathan on this flight? And why did it feel like this encounter was no coincidence? The answers were closer than Marcus realized, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Marcus spent the next hour staring at his laptop, though he wasn't reading a single word. His mind kept returning to the Wacth case, and the man sitting just inches away. Jonathan Harris had dismantled Marcus's confidence back then, and now, here he was again, calm, composed, and undeniably in control. He glanced sideways at Jonathan, who was flipping through his book as if nothing had happened. Marcus felt an irrational urge to probe further, to understand why their paths had crossed again. "You know," Marcus began, his voice low enough not to wake the other passengers, "that case wasn't as straightforward as you made it out to be." Jonathan didn't look up, but his calm reply came quickly. "Justice rarely is." Marcus leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "The company I represented, we were painted as villains. But Crestfield provided thousands of jobs. It wasn't all bad." Jonathan turned the page, seemingly uninterested in the argument. "Jobs built on inequality and exploitation don't count as progress." Marcus stiffened at the bluntness of the statement. He opened his mouth to retort, but Jonathan finally set his book down and turned to face him fully. "Let me ask you something, Marcus," Jonathan said, his voice steady but piercing. "Did you ever stop to question what you were defending, or was winning the only thing that mattered?" The question hit harder than Marcus expected. He swallowed, trying to find a response. "It's not that simple," he managed. "Isn't it?" Jonathan asked, leaning back in his seat. "What we defend defines us. If we don't question it, we lose sight of who we are." Marcus didn't reply, his thoughts churning. Jonathan's words felt uncomfortably personal, cutting deeper than the surface argument. He hadn't just lost a case all those years ago, he'd lost a piece of himself, though he was only realizing it now. The silence between them stretched until it was interrupted by the flight attendant, who returned to Jonathan's seat with a hushed voice. "Mr. Harris," she said softly, "the captain wants you to know we'll be landing on schedule. Your arrangements in Tokyo are confirmed." Jonathan nodded in acknowledgement, but the interaction caught Marcus's attention. "Arrangements?" he asked, curiosity laced with suspicion. Jonathan met Marcus's gaze, his expression unreadable. "I have business to attend to," he said simply. Marcus frowned. "What kind of business?" Jonathan hesitated for a moment, then said, "The kind that requires discretion." The cryptic response only deepened Marcus's unease. He turned back to his laptop, but the memory of their earlier conversation nagged at him. Jonathan's question lingered in his mind. "What are you defending?" Unable to let it go, Marcus began typing furiously, his fingers searching through legal archives. He looked up Jonathan Harris, determined to find out more. What he discovered left him breathless. Jonathan wasn't just a retired judge. He was a key figure in several ongoing investigations into corporate fraud and systemic corruption. His rulings had dismantled powerful networks and exposed practices that Marcus had once considered untouchable. But there was something else, a sealed case file involving a whistleblower at Crestfield Corporation. Marcus's heart raced as he scrolled through the sparse details. The file was marked with Jonathan's name and a cryptic note, "Key witness under protection." A sinking feeling settled in Marcus's stomach. Could this have something to do with their meeting now? He glanced at Jonathan, who was once again calmly reading his book, as though nothing in the world could disturb him. Marcus leaned back, his mind racing. "This isn't a coincidence," he muttered under his breath. Jonathan, as if hearing him, closed his book and turned to Marcus. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a faint smile. Marcus forced a laugh, but his unease was growing. Who was the real Jonathan Harris? And why did it feel like Marcus was about to find himself in the middle of something far bigger than he ever anticipated? The cabin lights dimmed as the flight progressed, but Marcus's mind was anything but still. His discovery about the sealed case file had set off alarm bells, and every glance at Jonathan Harris only deepened his suspicion. What exactly was this key witness under protection, and why did Jonathan seem so unfazed? Unable to resist, Marcus opened his laptop again, diving deeper into the archives. He bypassed Crestfield's public documents and accessed lesser-known legal forums, searching for any connection between the corporation and Jonathan. After several frustrating dead ends, he stumbled upon an obscure blog post written by a former Crestfield employee. The post detailed a whistleblower who had exposed Crestfield's illegal labor practices, overseas practices that had been covered up for years. The whistleblower had provided crucial evidence in a landmark trial, but their identity had been kept hidden due to threats from powerful individuals. The name of the judge presiding over the trial? Jonathan Harris. Marcus's pulse quickened. The pieces were starting to fit together. Jonathan hadn't just ruled on the Wacth case. He had been central to dismantling the very system Marcus had once defended. Late-night research? Jonathan's voice broke through Marcus's thoughts. Marcus flinched, quickly closing his laptop. "Just catching up on some work," he lied, his tone unconvincing. Jonathan's knowing gaze lingered for a moment before he spoke. "You're not the first person to dig into my past, Marcus. But I wonder, what are you hoping to find?" The question hit too close to home, and Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I remembered your name, that's all. It's not every day you meet someone who's made headlines." Jonathan gave a faint smile, leaning back in his seat. Headlines aren't always the full story. Sometimes, the truth lies in what's left unsaid. The cryptic response unsettled Marcus even more. He hesitated, then decided to confront Jonathan directly. You were involved in a whistleblower case against Crestfield, weren't you? The sealed file it's connected to you. Jonathan's expression didn't change, but his silence spoke volumes. I knew it, Marcus pressed. That's why you're here, isn't it? This business, you mentioned it's about the whistleblower. Jonathan turned to face Marcus fully, his eyes sharp. You're asking dangerous questions, Marcus. Be careful where they lead you. The warning was clear, but it only fueled Marcus's determination. I deserve to know the truth, he said, his voice firm. I was part of that system. I need to know what really happened. Jonathan studied Marcus for a long moment before sighing. Fine. If you want the truth, then listen carefully. Leaning in, Jonathan lowered his voice. The whistleblower was an employee at Crestfield, a woman named Sarah King. She uncovered evidence of forced labor, fraud, and environmental violations, all hidden under layers of fake compliance reports. She came to me because no one else would take her case. Crestfield had too much power, too much money. Why is it sealed? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because after the case was won, Sarah disappeared, Jonathan said gravely. There were threats, attempts to silence her. We had to erase her existence to protect her. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. And you think those threats still exist? Jonathan nodded. Powerful enemies don't just vanish. They adapt, waiting for the right moment to strike. The weight of Jonathan's words settled heavily on Marcus. He had always prided himself on his success, but now he saw the cost of the system he had upheld. So, why are you flying to Tokyo? Marcus asked. Jonathan hesitated before answering. Because Sarah contacted me after years in hiding. She's ready to expose what's left of Crestfield's operations. I'm here to make sure she stays alive long enough to do it. Marcus's heart pounded as he processed the revelation. The man sitting next to him wasn't just a retired judge, he was a guardian of truth, standing against forces Marcus had once considered untouchable. The question now was whether Marcus would help him or become another obstacle in Jonathan's dangerous mission. The hum of the plane's engines seemed louder as Marcus processed Jonathan's revelation. The idea that someone had lived in hiding for years, threatened by the very system Marcus had served, unsettled him deeply. He leaned back in his seat, staring at the dark expanse outside the window. Why tell me all this? Marcus asked finally, his voice low but tense. You barely know me. Jonathan turned to him, his expression calm but unreadable. Because I think you're at a crossroads, Marcus. And sometimes, hearing the truth is the first step to choosing the right path. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when the overhead intercom crackled. The captain's voice came through, steady yet firm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. The announcement drew their attention, but it wasn't the only thing that fell off. As the plane jolted slightly, Marcus noticed a man seated a few rows ahead standing and moving toward the galley despite the announcement. Jonathan's gaze followed the man, his expression sharpening. Something's not right, Jonathan murmured, more to himself than Marcus. What do you mean? Marcus asked, sitting up straighter. Jonathan didn't answer. Immediately. Instead, he unfastened his seatbelt and stood. Stay here, he said, his tone low but commanding. Marcus hesitated. What are you doing? The seatbelt sign is on. Jonathan gave him a brief look. I've dealt with enough threats to recognize one when I see it. Before Marcus could protest, Jonathan walked down the aisle, his movements deliberate yet unassuming. Marcus watched as he approached the galley, where the man from earlier was speaking in hushed tones to a flight attendant. The attendant's body language was tense, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Jonathan stepped closer, his presence drawing the man's attention. Excuse me, Jonathan said calmly, but the captain requested all passengers remain seated. Is there a problem here? The man turned slowly, his expression cold. He was tall and lean, dressed in a nondescript black jacket. His eyes flicked over Jonathan before he gave a tight smile. "No problem. Just asking for some water." Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't press further. "Then I'm sure the flight attendant can help you quickly. You should return to your seat before the turbulence worsens." The man's smile faltered, but he nodded and moved back toward his seat. Jonathan watched him go, his mind working quickly. When he returned to his own seat, Marcus leaned in. "What was that about?" "That man isn't just thirsty," Jonathan said quietly. "He's nervous, too nervous, for someone on a routine flight." Marcus glanced at the man, who was now sitting stiffly, his eyes scanning the cabin. "You think he's connected to Sarah?" "It's possible," Jonathan admitted. "Or he could be working for someone who doesn't want her story to come out." Marcus felt his stomach churn. "What do we do?" Jonathan leaned back, his face thoughtful. "We wait. If he's here for Sarah, he'll make a move before the flight lands." The turbulence worsened, and the cabin lights flickered briefly, drawing murmurs from the passengers. Marcus's unease grew. The calm, controlled world he'd always relied on felt as though it were unraveling. "Jonathan," he said quietly, "if this gets dangerous, what's the plan?" Jonathan's gaze was steady. "The plan is to protect Sarah at all costs. And if that means taking risks, so be it." Marcus felt the weight of those words. For the first time, he began to understand the gravity of Jonathan's mission and the danger that now surrounded. Thump. As the plane jolted again, Marcus's thoughts raced. He wasn't sure where he stood in all of this, but one thing was clear. The turbulence wasn't just in the air, it was in the choices that lay ahead. The plane continued to shudder under the turbulence, the dim cabin lights casting uneasy shadows. Marcus's grip tightened on the armrest as he stole another glance at the mysterious man in the black jacket. His movements were subtle, but the way his eyes darted around the cabin sent Marcus's nerves into overdrive. "Jonathan," Marcus whispered, leaning closer, "he's watching the attendants. What if he's planning something?" Jonathan's calm demeanor remained unshaken. "That's what I'm trying to determine. Keep your seatbelt on and stay observant." But Jonathan cut him off with a firm look. "Marcus, I've dealt with people like him before. Panicking won't help anyone." Before Marcus could respond, the intercom crackled again. The captain's voice, though steady, carried a note of urgency. "We're experiencing prolonged turbulence. For safety, all passengers must remain seated and ensure their seatbelts are fastened." The man in black ignored the announcement. He shifted in his seat, reaching for the bag at his feet. Jonathan tensed, his sharp eyes catching the motion. "Stay here," Jonathan murmured. He unbuckled his seatbelt and rose, moving down the aisle with the controlled confidence of someone who had navigated tense situations before. Marcus's heart pounded as he watched. Jonathan approached the man again. This time, the stranger looked up, his expression hardening. "Sir," Jonathan said, his voice low but commanding, "the captain asked everyone to remain seated. Is there something you need?" The man stared at him for a moment before forcing a smile. "Just adjusting my bag. Nothing to worry about." Jonathan's gaze lingered on the bag. "You should put it back under the seat. Turbulence can cause loose items to become dangerous." The man hesitated, his smile faltering. Then, with deliberate slowness, he pushed the bag back under his seat. "Thanks for the advice," he said, his tone clipped. Jonathan nodded, but didn't move. Instead, he leaned closer, lowering his voice so only the man could hear. "Whatever you're planning, don't." The man's eyes narrowed, his forced smile vanishing. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but there was a dangerous edge to his voice now. Jonathan straightened, his presence imposing despite the confined space. "Good," he said simply, then turned and walked back to his seat. Marcus leaned in as soon as Jonathan sat down. "What did he say?" "Nothing useful," Jonathan replied, his voice low. "But he's definitely not here by accident. He's testing the waters." Marcus's chest tightened. Testing for what? Timing, Jonathan said. If he's working for someone who doesn't want Sarah's testimony to surface, he might be here to ensure it never does. The weight of Jonathan's words sank heavily on Marcus. You think he could? Let's not jump to conclusions, Jonathan said firmly. But we need to be ready for anything. As the plane jolted again, the cabin lights flickered once more. Passengers murmured nervously, and the flight attendants hurried to reassure them. Marcus's eyes darted to the man in black, who was now leaning back in his seat, his expression unreadable. What if he's armed? Marcus whispered. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a pen and a small notebook. He scribbled something quickly, then handed the paper to Marcus. What's this? Marcus asked. A contingency, Jonathan said. If something happens, take this to the authorities in Tokyo. It has Sarah's current location and the name of the contact who can protect her. Marcus stared at the note, the gravity of the situation finally hitting him. This wasn't just a tense flight. It was a dangerous mission, with lives on the line. Jonathan, Marcus said, his voice trembling slightly, are you sure about this? Jonathan's gaze was steady, unyielding. I've never been surer of anything. As the plane jolted once more, Marcus tucked the note into his jacket pocket. The turbulence outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing within the cabin. The cabin lights dimmed further as the turbulence grew more erratic. Passengers murmured anxiously, some clutching their armrests, while others nervously flipped through in-flight magazines. Marcus couldn't take his eyes off the man in black. Every movement he made, every glance around the cabin, felt calculated. Jonathan sat calmly beside him, though Marcus noticed his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest, a subtle sign of the tension beneath his composed exterior. Then it happened. The man in black suddenly stood, ignoring the seatbelt sign, and strode toward the galley at the front of the cabin. His bag was clutched tightly in his hand. Jonathan rose instantly. Stay here, he instructed Marcus, his voice low but firm. Marcus grabbed Jonathan's arm. What are you going to do? Jonathan didn't answer. His sharp gaze was locked on the man as he made his way down the aisle. The flight attendant in the galley stiffened as the man approached, her polite smile faltering. Jonathan moved swiftly, closing the distance, his voice calm but commanding. Sir, the captain has asked everyone to remain seated. Please return to your seat. The man turned slowly, his expression cold. Mind your own business, he snapped. Jonathan didn't flinch. This is my business now. Put the bag down and step back. Passengers nearby began to whisper, their fear palpable. The flight attendant took a cautious step back, her eyes darting between Jonathan and the man. You don't want to do this, Jonathan continued, his voice steady. The man's hand tightened on the strap of his bag. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, his tone filled with warning. Don't I? Jonathan replied, his calm demeanor unshaken. I've seen men like you before, desperate, working for someone who treats you like a pawn. But whatever you think you're achieving here, it's not worth it. The man's jaw clenched, but his resolve seemed to waver. Marcus, unable to stay seated any longer, moved cautiously toward the scene. His heart pounded as he approached. Jonathan, he said softly, what's going on? Jonathan didn't take his eyes off the man in black. Marcus, go back to your seat. But Marcus ignored the order. He glanced at the man, his instinct screaming that something was deeply wrong. Whatever you're doing, Marcus said, his voice trembling slightly, it's not too late to stop. The man's eyes flicked between Jonathan and Marcus. For a moment, the tension hung so thick it felt like the entire plane was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the man dropped the bag. The sound of it hitting the floor made several passengers gasp. Jonathan moved quickly, stepping forward and kicking the bag away. The flight attendant darted in to grab it, her hands trembling as she carried it toward the cockpit. What's in the bag? Marcus asked, his voice tight with fear. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the man, his voice firm. "This ends here. Whatever they promised you, it's not worth the cost." The man's shoulders slumped, his defiance crumbling under Jonathan's unwavering gaze. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered. "There's always a choice," Jonathan replied. "But you have to live with the consequences of yours." Before anyone could respond further, two uniformed air marshals emerged from the rear of the plane, moving swiftly toward the galley. They subdued the man with practiced efficiency, escorting him back to his seat under watchful eyes. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Jonathan," he whispered, "what was in the bag?" Jonathan's face was unreadable. "If I had to guess, evidence. Something meant to threaten Sarah or silence her for good." "How can you be so calm?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Jonathan turned to him, his expression grave. "Because this isn't over. Whoever sent him won't stop with this." Marcus felt the weight of Jonathan's words settle over him. The plane might have been safe for now, but the storm they were heading into was far from over. As the cabin slowly returned to a tense normalcy, Marcus realized he was no longer just a bystander in Jonathan's mission. He was part of it now, for better or worse. The cabin hummed with subdued whispers. Though the man in black was now under watch by air marshals, the tension in the air lingered. Marcus sat in silence, replaying the confrontation in his mind. What had Jonathan meant when he said this wasn't over? Jonathan, ever composed, leaned back in his seat. Yet his gaze was distant, fixed on some unseen horizon. Marcus broke the silence. "What happens when we land?" Jonathan turned to him, his eyes sharp but tired. "We meet Sarah. If she's ready to come forward, we get her into protective custody." "And if she's not ready?" Marcus asked hesitantly. "Then we buy her more time," Jonathan said simply. "But Marcus, you need to understand, Sarah coming forward isn't just about exposing Crestfield. It's about dismantling a system that's hurt countless lives. If she backs out, that system continues." Marcus felt a pang of guilt. He had been part of that system once, defending corporations like Crestfield with arguments he now realized were hollow. "What made you take her case?" Marcus asked. Jonathan's expression softened slightly. "She reminded me of my daughter," he admitted after a pause. Sarah's courage was the only thing standing between Crestfield's victims. And silence. I couldn't ignore that. The mention of his daughter caught Marcus off guard. Jonathan rarely spoke about his personal life, and the vulnerability in his voice was striking. "Where is she now?" "Your daughter?" Jonathan's face clouded. "Gone," he said quietly. "A car accident 5 years ago. She was studying law, wanted to fight for people like Sarah. I suppose, in a way, this is my way of honoring her." The weight of Jonathan's loss settled over Marcus, silencing him for a moment. He glanced at the man in black, now slumped in his seat under the watchful eyes of the air marshals. "Do you think Sarah will go through with it?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "She's strong, but fear has a way of clouding even the bravest hearts. That's why I'm here to remind her she's not alone." Marcus nodded, his own resolve hardening. "What can I do to help?" Jonathan studied him for a moment, as if weighing the sincerity of the offer. "When we land, stay close. If anything happens, follow the plan I gave you. Get the note to the authorities." Before Marcus could respond, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Tokyo. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The announcement sent a ripple of movement through the cabin. Jonathan straightened in his seat, his calm exterior returning, though Marcus could sense the tension simmering beneath. As the plane descended, Marcus couldn't help but feel the enormity of what awaited them on the ground. He had come on this flight as a bystander, but now he was entangled in a mission far larger than himself, a mission that could save lives or destroy them. When the plane touched down, the air felt heavier. The seatbelt sign clicked off, and passengers began to gather their belongings. Jonathan turned to Marcus, his voice steady but firm. Stay alert. We're not safe yet. The words sent a chill down Marcus's spine, but he nodded. Together, they stepped off the plane and into Narita Airport, the crowd bustling around them. Jonathan's phone buzzed, and he pulled it from his pocket, frowning as he read the screen. She's here, he said, his voice barely audible over the noise of the terminal. Where? Marcus asked, his heart pounding. Jonathan gestured toward the arrivals area, where a petite woman with a hooded jacket stood nervously. Near the edge of the crowd, her eyes darted around, her posture tense. That's Sarah, Jonathan said. Marcus's breath hitched. She looked nothing like he had imagined, fragile, almost, yet her presence carried a weight he couldn't describe. Jonathan started toward her, but as they moved closer, Marcus noticed something out of the corner of his eye, a man in a suit lingering near the exit, his gaze fixed on Sarah. Jonathan, Marcus whispered urgently, we're being watched. Jonathan's expression darkened. Stay close, he ordered. As they reached Sarah, she looked up, her eyes wide with fear. You made it, she whispered, her voice trembling. We're here to help, Jonathan assured her, his tone calm. But we need to move. Now. The man in the suit began to follow, his pace quickening. Marcus felt his heart race as he realized they were no longer just fighting a conspiracy, they were being hunted. The bustling terminal of Narita Airport buzzed with activity, but to Jonathan, Marcus, and Sarah, every face felt like a potential threat. The man in the suit trailed them, his pace deliberate yet unrelenting. Jonathan's calm facade remained, but his sharp eyes scanned their surroundings for an exit. Stay close, Jonathan instructed, his voice low but firm. Marcus glanced back, his pulse racing. The man was closing in, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. Jonathan, he's gaining on us, Marcus muttered. I see him, Jonathan replied without turning. Don't look back. That only gives him confirmation. Sarah's breathing was shallow, her hood pulled tightly around her face. They found me, she whispered, panic seeping into her voice. They didn't find you, Jonathan said firmly, his tone steady. They found us. There's a difference. They rounded a corner, merging into a crowded hallway leading toward the taxi stands. Jonathan slowed just enough to blend with the flow of people, but his mind worked furiously. Marcus tugged on his sleeve. What's the plan? We can't outrun him forever. Jonathan's jaw tightened. We won't have to. If we get to the rendezvous point, we'll have backup. Sarah hesitated, her steps faltering. What? If they're watching the exits? Jonathan stopped abruptly, turning to face her. Sarah, listen to me. You're not alone in this. We're going to get you to safety, but you have to trust me. Her wide eyes searched his face before she nodded, her resolve strengthening. The man in the suit was now unmistakably following them, his hand brushing his jacket pocket, a silent, ominous gesture. Jonathan caught it out of the corner of his eye. Change your plan, Jonathan said, steering them toward a side corridor marked staff only. Are we allowed back here? Marcus asked, his voice tinged with panic. We're not asking for permission, Jonathan said flatly. The corridor was narrower, quieter, and poorly lit, a stark contrast to the busy terminal. Jonathan led the way, his hand brushing against his pocket. Marcus noticed the motion. You're armed? Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. Only as a last resort, Jonathan replied. Behind them, the sound of footsteps quickened. Marcus turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of the man in the suit closing the gap. Jonathan's voice was calm but urgent. When I say run, you run. No questions. Do you understand? Marcus nodded. Sarah swallowed. Hard, but didn't protest. The man in the suit suddenly called out. Stop. You're only making it worse for yourselves. Jonathan didn't flinch. Instead, he slowed his pace, allowing the man to gain ground. Then, in a low voice, he said, Now. Marcus and Sarah bolted down the corridor as Jonathan spun to face their pursuer. The man hesitated for a split second, clearly not expecting resistance. "You don't want to do this," Jonathan said, his voice like steel. The man smirked, his hand darting into his jacket. "It's not up to me." Jonathan moved with startling speed, disarming the man before he could fully draw his weapon. A brief struggle ensued, the sound of heavy footsteps and muffled grunts echoing through the narrow space. Marcus and Sarah stopped at the end of the corridor, turning back just in time to see Jonathan slam the man against the wall, knocking him unconscious. Jonathan straightened, breathing heavily, as he retrieved the weapon and checked the man's pockets. He pulled out a phone, its screen locked but displaying a notification, awaiting confirmation. "What does it mean?" Marcus asked, his voice shaky. "It means he wasn't working alone," Jonathan said grimly. "There's more coming." Sarah's face paled. "We'll never make it out in time." "We will," Jonathan said firmly. He handed the phone to Marcus. "Keep this. It might tell us who else is after her." "Where do we go now?" Marcus asked. Jonathan gestured toward a service exit at the end of the corridor. "Through there. Our contact is waiting at the safe house. We have to move." As they stepped into the cool night air, the city of Tokyo stretched before them, a maze of lights and shadows. Jonathan hailed a waiting car, a nondescript sedan driven by a stern-looking man who nodded at Sarah. "Get in," Jonathan ordered. The three of them piled into the back seat as the car sped off into the night. Marcus clutched the phone tightly, his mind racing. The chase might have ended for now, but the danger was far from over. The sedan weaved through the bustling streets of Tokyo, its passengers silent but tense. Sarah clutched her hood tightly around her face, her eyes darting nervously toward the windows. Marcus held the confiscated phone in his hands, his thumbs tracing its edges, as if the answers they sought lay just beneath the screen. Jonathan sat upright, scanning their surroundings. Every streetlight, every shadow felt like it carried a threat. "We're close," he said to the driver. The car slowed as it approached a nondescript building in a quiet neighborhood. The driver pulled into an alley and cut the engine. "This is it," the driver said gruffly. Jonathan opened the door, motioning for Marcus and Sarah to follow. The air was crisp, the silence of the alley broken only by distant traffic. Jonathan led the way to a metal door, his movements quick but calculated. He knocked twice, paused, then knocked 3 more times. The door creaked open to reveal a woman in her 40s, with short-cropped hair and piercing eyes. "You made it," she said, stepping aside to let them in. "Thanks, Evelyn," Jonathan said as they entered. The safe house was sparse, but functional steel-reinforced walls, a few chairs, and a small table cluttered with maps and documents. Evelyn locked the door behind them, her expression wary as her gaze landed on Sarah. "You're lucky to be alive," Evelyn said, her tone brusque. Sarah lowered her hood. "I don't feel lucky." Jonathan turned to Evelyn. "Were there any signs of activity near here?" Evelyn shook her head. "Not yet, but they're out there. We don't have much time." Marcus held up the phone. "We found this on the guy following us. Any chance you can crack it?" Evelyn took the phone, studying it carefully. "I can try, but if they're tracking it, we'll need to move fast." She disappeared into an adjacent room, leaving the group alone. Jonathan placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "We'll get you through this. Just stay strong." But before Sarah could reply, the phone Evelyn had taken began to ring, a shrill sound that cut through the room like a knife. Jonathan stiffened, his hand instinctively moving toward his jacket. "Evelyn?" Jonathan called. No response. "Evelyn," he repeated louder this time. A second later, the door burst open, and Evelyn reappeared, holding the phone. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously. "Jonathan? Have a problem." "What is it?" he asked, stepping forward. Evelyn hesitated, then tossed the phone to Jonathan. "See for yourself." Jonathan caught it and glanced at the screen. It displayed a live feed of a dark room, where a man sat tied to a chair. His head was slumped forward, but Jonathan's breath hitched when the man lifted his head bruised, but alive. "David," Jonathan whispered. Marcus frowned. "Who's David?" "My contact in Tokyo," Jonathan said grimly. "He was supposed to meet us here tomorrow." A voice crackled through the phone. "Judge Harris," it said, cold and mechanical. "You've been predictable as ever. Hand over Sarah King, or your friend doesn't make it through the hour." The room fell silent. Sarah's face went pale, her eyes filling with tears. "They're here," she whispered. Jonathan's hand tightened around the phone. "You think threatening me will change anything? I've dealt with people like you before." The voice laughed softly. "And yet, here you are cornered. You can't win this, Judge Harris. You've already lost." Jonathan ended the call abruptly, his jaw tight. He turned to Evelyn. "Did the call give away our location?" Evelyn hesitated, her eyes shifting. "No, we're secure." Jonathan's sharp gaze lingered on her for a beat too long. Something wasn't right. "Where did you trace the call from?" Jonathan asked. Evelyn hesitated again, her hand brushing against her jacket pocket. "Northwest District," she said quickly. Jonathan's expression darkened. "That's impossible. The Northwest District is under heavy surveillance. There's no way they'd risk operating there." Marcus looked between them, his own suspicion growing. "What's going on?" Evelyn's hand moved suddenly, but Jonathan was faster. He grabbed her wrist, revealing a small transmitter concealed in her palm. "You're working for them," Jonathan said, his voice cold. Evelyn's face twisted with regret, but her voice was defiant. "You don't understand. They gave me no choice. It was either this, or—" Jonathan's grip tightened. "Or what?" "They have my family," she said, tears welling in her eyes. Marcus stepped forward. "Jonathan, wait. Maybe we can use this. If they trust her, we can turn it against them." Jonathan hesitated, then released her. "If you're lying, Evelyn, I'll know." Evelyn nodded, her shoulders slumping. "What do you need me to do?" Jonathan glanced at Sarah and Marcus. "We fight back. But first, we make sure David stays alive." The room fell into tense silence as the weight of the moment settled on them. Jonathan turned to Sarah, his voice resolute. "No matter what happens, we see this through. The truth comes out, and we end this." The night was far from over, but as Jonathan, Marcus, Sarah, and Evelyn prepared for the next stage of their mission, one thing was clear: the battle for justice was never easy. Every step forward came with risks, sacrifices, and hard choices. Jonathan's unwavering resolve inspired those around him, even as danger loomed. Sarah's courage grew stronger with each passing moment. Her decision to stand against Crestfield solidified. Marcus, once a defender of the very system that allowed corruption to thrive, now found himself on the other side, ready to fight for what truly mattered. The journey wasn't just about exposing a corporation. It was about changing lives, tearing down the walls of silence, and building a world where truth and accountability prevailed. As their fight continued, one question remained: how far would you go to stand up for justice? If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We bring you thrilling stories of resilience, courage, and justice every week. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible journey. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.